Good evening once again, everyone, and welcome to day 10 of Caribbean Women Honors and Empowerment, the Trinidad and Tobago chapter, 16 Days of Activism interview series. My name is Wendy H. Lewis, and I am the District Manager and Chair of CWHE, and I would like to introduce you to this evening's hosts. Mrs. Marsha Bailey Owen is a gifted individual who has a passion for service and children. Mrs. Bailey Owen is the holder of a bachelor's in social work with minors in psychology and social policy. At the postgraduate level, Mrs. Bailey Owen holds a master's degree in social work with specialization in administration and management. Her career began in the public sector in the area of family intervention, moving on to child protection. As a social work professional, Mrs. Bailey Owen has managed social service agencies and social workers in the public sector. Mrs. Bailey Owen's social work experiences ranges from clinical interventions to social work management, policy formulation, and human resources management. Mrs. Bailey Owen is a founding member of Caribbean Women Honors and Empowerment Trinidad and Tobago chapter and has served as Vice Chair and Social Services Director for the past 5 years. I would also like to take this opportunity to introduce you to our interviewee, Mr. Raymond Popplewell. Mr. Raymond Popplewell is a clinical psychologist who obtained his bachelor's in psychology with a minor in social policy at UWI St. Augustine and an MSc in mental health and clinical psychology at London South Bank University. While residing in the UK, Mr. Popplewell gained experience working at Maytree, a suicide respite center in North London, where he offered psychotherapy sessions and intervention plans. This included working closely with autistic young adults to promote independence and life skills tailored to their individual care plan and to enhance inclusivity in the community. As a mental health well-being mentor in a UK-based company, MindHub, Mr. Popplewell also worked on developing mental health safe practices to be incorporated within the workplace. Since his return to Trinidad, Mr. Popplewell worked at Student Support Services Division, Special Education Unit at the Ministry of Education, where one-on-one support to special needs children was rendered. In 2020, Mr. Popplewell launched his organization, Mind at Ease, which is geared towards assisting individuals through counseling whilst providing mental health consultations to organizations. Mr. Popplewell is also a member of the COVID Response Crisis Intervention Team, a Trinidad and Tobago Association of Psychologists, TTAP initiative, which offers over-the-phone crisis intervention responses to individuals in distress during this pandemic. Before we welcome Mr. Popplewell to the forum, who is our interviewee for this evening, let's welcome Mrs. Marsha Bailey Owen.
Yeah, that's great. So thank you so much, Wendy. And yes, it is indeed a pleasure to have Raymond with us this evening. So Raymond, I'm not sure if you have been following our page, but we've been doing and having a lot of interesting conversations. But we want to be able to talk from a psychology perspective. Let's talk to some of the victims or some women and young girls generally. Are there any signs that someone can look for that may suggest that this person has the potential to be abusive?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mrs. Bailey Owen, and thank you very much, Wendy, for the introduction. Yes, there are signs that victims can look out for identifying a perpetrator of abuse. So some signs, predominantly abusers are confrontational. Some will be making threats. You will realize they like cursing and a bit more aggressive towards people. There are also signs of gaslighting. So gaslighting is a form of emotional abuse that's seen in abusive relationships mainly. It's defined as the act of manipulating a person by forcing them to question their thoughts or their memories.
Okay.
So that's a big sign of abusers. So they kind of try to manipulate you to believe that you, quote unquote, going crazy, or you don't kind of recall the acts that are happening. So it makes you question your reality. They also tend to kind of attack self-esteem and confidence by calling names or targeting insecurities, might make fun of the insecurities in public settings, around family or friends, and just make you feel uncomfortable in situations.
Right.
And another sign would be their lack of respect for your feelings. So you might call them out on what they're doing, and you might say, hey, this is not something that's making me happy. I need a bit more affection, a bit less of the harsh words. It's making me feel unworthy. It makes me feel bad about myself. And you kind of stop, and they will just completely ignore you or tell you, oh, it's not that serious, or kind of dismiss your feelings.
Right. Oh, good. Interesting to note. And I've also heard, in talking to some victims, the signs of the jealousy, or what they would have viewed as, oh, he's so loving, he doesn't want me to travel, he picks me up and drops me off, only to realize that that was kind of the precursor to them isolating. And it was similar to what you were talking about, the manipulation, the keeping them under lock and key. Very, very interesting. Raymond, I also know that you work with children.
Yes, I
Are
do.
there any telltale signs of children who may be either experiencing abuse? So let's say you see a child and, they may be withdrawn, or are there other symptoms that may be able to suggest that maybe this child may be a victim?
Yes, so there are symptoms that, or signs that a child may be a victim, because children they're very open and social, so they basically finish put everybody's business out there if you give them a chance.
Yes.
So you can note that different behaviors start developing. They might try to reenact, especially if it's like sexual abuse, they might try to reenact it onto another child in school.
Right.
Or they might say, or they might talk in code depending on what the abuser may have said to them.
Mm-hmm.
So, some people don't like to specify for children the private parts, saying vagina or penis. They will say like a cookie, and they might say, uncle took my cookie or something like that. So you have to kind of also be aware of, this is why it's important to start using the actual terms. That way it's not lost in translation, because they might be telling you what's happening, but because
using their own terminology.
Yes. So it's not taken as seriously. And you might find them no longer as social if they were outgoing. They might start being withdrawn. They might be doing anything they like. They might seem more sad, play by themselves, isolate themselves as well.
Mm-hmm. And so, putting you on the spot a little bit, Raymond, there are survivors who would say, when you ask, I don't know if you heard one of our survivors, Denise, she was saying that she stayed 12 years. And sometimes in talking to survivors, they say, I'm staying for the children. From a mental health perspective, is that helpful?
No, it's not helpful. Because one of the predicting factors for a potential abuser actually is being in an environment where abuse happens. So they learn the behaviors from watching parents socialize with each other. This now becomes normalized in how they view relationships should be. So if this is, I saw daddy hitting mommy, or I saw daddy being downgrading to mommy, maybe this is what love is, because daddy will come home and say, hey, I love you and mommy so much. So they now put the negative annotations to love, which is why we have a lot of these issues happening now.
Correct. And from a psychologist's perspective, what would be some of the strategies that we can use? I know, and I always talk about student support services, because I really do believe that they are able to really treat with our children who are exposed. But what would be some of the other strategies you think that we can implement, whether it's an NGO or the public sector, to try to stymie and reduce the number of gender-based violence issues we have?
So I think this needs to be tackled on many fronts, not just the activists or NGO forefront of it, but also from a law enforcement forefront, because I think we have a big disconnect, especially in Trinidad and Tobago, with how we persecute these perpetrators. So it kind of creates this disconnect for people wanting to come forward in the first place to say, I am a victim of abuse.
Yes.
Because with law enforcement. Sometimes you might be in physical or domestic violence situation, or you might have a sexual abuse, and the perpetrator is arrested, yes, but within a couple of weeks, months, they back out on the streets to terrorize you again. So a lot of people kind of won't come forward because they're afraid of the re-victimization or the threats that would have happened with any relationship if they have to encounter them again.
Okay.
But I do think that as NGOs having things like this, especially having talks on advocacy and kind of bringing it to the forefront is crucial, especially in this time. We need to start holding people accountable. We need to move away from victim blaming as well.
Yes.
And start these conversations, start cultural changes, they start societal changes. People have to now be introspective and understand, hey, well, maybe the way we were living before is producing more perpetrators now because we have this idea of this manly man, people like to say, and that toxic masculinity. When men are threatened out there, if I'm not the man of the house, then this is threatened to me, and that's where they kind of lash out. They don't know how to communicate their emotional responses properly. And this is kind of how power struggles happen, because abuse is mainly power and control.
Correct.
Those are the two main factors that influence an abuser. So if you don't tackle this cultural norm that we have going on, where we simply just brush off the victim side and say, so what did she do to deserve this? Or that's kind of how conversations go. Like, why was she there? Why did she do this? How did she?
Yes,
you know,
yes. It's always the victim. Yeah.
Yes, instead of addressing what drove him to do this, why is he and what were settings, what of his socialization, why are we not addressing the mental health of men, and why are we just completely putting the blame on the victim themselves? Because sometimes we actually victimize in a sense when we...
Yes, we do.
The way we talk about victims, I know, unfortunately, today we got the news that the young girl's body was found in Santa Cruz.
Yes.
And I saw on social media just people talking about where was she? Why was she with that taxi driver? And just putting the blame on her. And yes, and it was kind of like, why are we as a culture not being more
sensitive? Yes, that's a whole list.
Well, but
correct.
Why are we shifting blame? Why are we?
Yes.
And have this? Why are women trying to have this victim mindset? But no, we need to start socializing and parenting our men to protect women.
Excellent.
We need to move away from the toxic masculinity, as I said, and teach men how to properly express their emotions, how to properly deal with their emotions, and just bottle it up until they're frustrated and want to lash out or break things or threaten people. So I think these advocacy NGOs are doing a good job. I applaud you all for having this 16 days of activism, because raising awareness is the first step, but we also need to meet at law enforcement, social policies, all kind of intertwining to provide proper support for victims.
Excellent. And you know, we were trying to actually get a perpetrator, and the reason we wanted to get a perpetrator, not to, you know, belittle them, but it's just to be able to get in their minds, you know, what may have triggered, what may have, you know, caused you to feel that you had the power to be able to do this to another individual. But from a clinical psychology perspective, is there a kind of profile that, yes, I know research says sometimes you see it as a child and so it translates into adulthood, but are there other things that we can look at?
Yeah, so I was reading about profiles of abusers, and I came across this article by Fuller, and he kind of categorized abusers into 3 categories: predatory abusers, effectively motivated abusers, and those that are instrumental abusers.
Right.
I'm just going to kind of give you an idea of what these categories mean.
Sure.
So for him, predatory abusers were those that did not show any emotion to the time of the offense. It was more of a calculated and focused attack. So, and he said that these abusers are usually people who have borderline personality disorder or suffer from sociopathic tendencies. So borderline personality disorder is a mental health issue, and oftentimes goes undiagnosed because, especially within the Caribbean, because we have a stigma against mental health and seeking seeking assistance. You don't want people to label your child as crazy, or you just want to feel like you're doing a good job, so you kind of move away from getting them assessed even if you saw signs.
Right.
And for the affective, he talked about motivated by feelings in terms of they are not able to regulate their feelings at the moment. So they kind of lash up and let it build. And once it builds up, they lash out. So, but they are more empathetic to their victims in terms of they will be more remorseful and they understand that they're
hits you, yes.
Yes. So they kind of move along to those lines. And in instrumental abusers, he said, we're like the mid-range group in terms of they're not completely emotionless, but they're not very
empathetic,
emotionally attached. Yes. So there's neither pure, it's just pure coincidence. It's more of an impulse kind of, but yes, I still have a connection to you. So it's not like they don't know you at all, like the predatory abusers.
Right.
They still have a connection to you, but it's more of an impulse in the moment.
But you know, you said something very interesting there, Raymond. And you know, it only when you said it, it really reiterated that, you know, for a lot of, well, not a lot, but for some perpetrators, there could be the reality of mental health issues. Because I remember a client and she was saying, you know, Miss Bailey, no, I wasn't Owen then, I was Miss Bailey. And she said, you know, Miss Bailey, my husband seems like a Jekyll and Hyde scenario. And I'm saying, but you know, when she said it, because as you're saying, you know, we are not prone to talk about or embrace mental health issues. And so, you know, we kind of were both very dismissive of it. But there are realities because there may also be persons who are suffering with alcoholism, substance abuse, and that too triggers behavior. But I'm looking at our time and, you know, I want to be able to capture everything. So if you were to give advice to, let's say, our young girls and women in terms of being aware, paying attention to their own mental health status while in this this relationship that may be toxic or exposed to any kind of gender-based violence, what would be your advice to them?
So my advice first and foremost will be none of the abuse is your fault. You don't deserve to be treated or harmed by anyone. There's no logical explanation that could justify why your partner is either physically abusing you, emotionally abusing you, mentally abusing you. There's no justification for it. My second piece of advice would also be you are not alone in situation. There's support available. So try to reach out to professional services. It has safe houses, there are crisis hotlines, there are therapists. And if you think that your life is in imminent danger, get the law enforcement. And yes, I know I mentioned earlier that sometimes there's a disconnect, but still don't let this prevent you from reaching out. Because we are here to help. Excellent. So we don't want situations to get dire extent. We want to prevent it before it can escalate. Excellent. So I'll also suggest if you cannot escape or you're probably not in the space to leave yet, because abuse is something that takes time. It's a grooming process. So people always say, why don't you just leave? It's not as simple as just walking away. These are people who have played on your emotions. These are people who have probably lifted you up so high before that this crush, as we can call it, is like, okay, maybe I can change him to get him back to how he was before. So we kind of try to justify. So, like I said, if you're not ready there, then to leave, create a safety plan. And why is this important is because it's a mental plan. You don't necessarily have to like physically write out a plan or anything. It's a mental plan in case of an event becoming threat to your life. So you don't, if you have in a physical domestic violence relationship, you don't want to just escalate and then you don't know where to go, you don't know where to run. So this just like a pre-plan in case it turns something where weapons are now involved or something, you can escape the threat of your life. And I know you mentioned it. If your safety is, if you're staying for the sake of children, I think it's something that will cause more harm to them. Being witness to it, children pick up on when things are not right, whether you think they're aware or not, they do pick up on these things. And it affects their mental health as well. It also leaves them in space to become potential victims, depending on how the dynamic goes. If they can't get to you, they might try to get to the children. So you don't want to put your children at that risk. And for future relationships, if you do decide you want to have future relationships, just be aware of some of the patterns, some of the things, early signs to look at. That way you don't end up in another abusive relationship, and make sure that you just don't isolate yourself don't cut off family, don't cut off friends. Social support is one of the most crucial things we could have in times of crisis, and have those people that you can trust around you to just vent to.
Well, thank you so much, Raymond. I think we got, a very clear picture of the mindset of not only the victims, but perpetrators. We have a sense that, mental health is critical to both sides. And so we really want to thank you. I know there may be some comments, and we could probably answer tomorrow or later on as our time, as our time has run out. But we really want to thank you on behalf of the board and management of CWHE for taking the time to be able to talk to us and participate in our 16 days of activism.
Thank you so very much for having me.
You're welcome.